Welcome to the Cold Case Christianity broadcast, the only Christian case-making program hosted by a cold case homicide detective. J. Warner Wallace has been investigating cold case murders in Los Angeles County for over a decade. His work has been featured on Fox News, Court TV, and Dateline. For more information about Jim's work and the case for Christianity, please visit coldcasechristianity.com. Now, here's your host, J. Warner Wallace.
Thanks for joining me back here at Cold Case Christianity. I'm J. Warner Wallace, and we have been in Season 5. As a matter of fact, as I'm recording this, we're wrapping up Season 5 of our show here on NRB TV. And if you also follow along with us on our podcast, I so appreciate it. You can find our podcast at our website, where you can also find a link to our phone app, where we're starting to collect all of the information from Season 5. We're posting it both in terms of articles. It's posted there in terms of our season show. You'll see in the video section, in the podcast section, all of our shows going back, links to the YouTube channel, all of this stuff that'll help you to find our resources. Because what we've been doing is collecting shows going back now here at NRB. I think this is 5 years. We're in Season 5. But we have podcasts going back 10 years. And all of that stuff is located at our website and on our YouTube channel. I would actually encourage you to subscribe to our YouTube channel, where we post 3 new videos a week. And so if you're subscribed, you'll get notified about that, and you can watch our videos on a weekly basis. All right, that being said, I want to jump back into our topic for Season 5, which is our quick shots. And these are simply quick responses, rhetorically powerful responses to the most common objections to the Christian worldview. And of course, we've written these along with also another collection of articles online that we try to really help you to get brief, quick answers to move past an objection. You know, I don't know if you've ever noticed this, but there are some of us who, when we talk about these issues related to the Christian worldview or to God's existence, we're really prepared to be conversation stoppers. And I have encountered people online, both online and in my personal life, who have a set of objections they know are conversation stoppers. And once you move past that objection, they don't really hold it deeply, is what I'm trying to say. It's not as though this is necessarily, for some it is, but it's not necessarily an objection they've thought, for 5 years about, and they've thought of every single possible answer. They just know if they say this, the conversation will stop. And so as I move past that conversation stopper, I find that they usually will switch to try another conversation stopper. So in other words, okay, it's like I had an answer for that, and that was only intended to derail me, and it hasn't derailed me, so now I'll switch to another objection. And I can't tell you how many times I've offered responses to objections just to have them drop that objection quickly and move to another objection. Maybe you've seen that in your own life as well. And look, that's okay. I mean, I spent a lot of years doing that myself as an atheist, right? I knew that Christians were not ready to answer the objections. So it was easy for me just to throw up a wall in the form of an objection that I knew they couldn't climb over. And so that they'd be done. And in the end, I just didn't want to have the conversation. But can we do this in such a way? Can we climb over the wall with them in such a way that we're winsome enough not to alienate them? Remember, the gospel message that you are a sinner in need of a Savior is offensive enough to people in our culture today that we don't need to add offense by just being somebody who's spanking them with answers. Instead, what we want to do is we want to love people love the wall down so that the gospel can be heard. So in the end, I want to make sure, and where I look back at my own videos, I will tell you this. I've spoken now all over the country for 6 years after writing the first book. And I can tell you that those videos that I am most uncomfortable with are the ones where I watch my own response and I think, that doesn't seem gracious enough. That seems rather arrogant. Look, I'm just like you. I don't hold a PhD in cosmology, biology, and textual criticism, any of that. I'm just somebody who makes cases in front of a jury. If I can do this, you can do this. The reality of it is, though, my concern is that I don't want to come off as arrogant. I don't want to come off as off-putting. And that is always my biggest concern. But I think if you really think about this, in a culture that is shifting away from objective claims about anything, anytime we think we have an exclusive truth, that is going to be off-putting for a lot of people. And we're going to have to win them with our character. And that's why I think it's so important for us to spend time with people who we've already earned the right to speak to, because they've been around us long enough to know who we are. I don't have to win them in 5 minutes with my character to try to share some truth. They've known me for 35 years. I have a better chance, I hope, unless I've been stepping all over that relationship, I hope I have a better chance of reaching them with the truth claim. So anyway, all that being said, let's get to today's topic and how we might use these quick shots. Remember, we're going to use them in the context of being winsome. And we're going to answer today an objection that I hear occasionally. I'll put it on the screen for you. Here it is. This idea that, you're only a Christian because you happen to be raised in a Christian culture. If you were raised in a Muslim culture, it's not about whether Christianity is true or any spiritual worldview is true or any religious worldview is true. You just ended up adopting the one that was dominant in your culture. You just ended up adopting the one that you happen to be raised in. It's not about it being true. It just happened to be available. It happened to be, you were saturated in it. So the idea here is that you're only a Christian because you were raised in a Christian country or in a Christian-dominated culture. It has nothing to do with truth. It has to do with what's convenient. Okay, I do hear that occasionally, and I wanted to be able to answer it with you. I wanted you to get past that obstacle, and we're going to give you 3 ways to respond to that today. Let's do the first one. The first quick shot response to that objection. I'm putting it on the screen so you can see it. Here it is. Okay, I'll agree with you that it's probably true that some Christians are only believers because they were raised that way. I mean, I'm not going to argue about that, but that isn't the case for most Christians throughout. Well, it may be the case for most Christians, but it certainly isn't the case for all Christians. Especially in the early years, it wasn't even the case for most Christians in the earliest years. I mean, think about how Christianity began. It began in a largely Jewish and pagan culture, a polytheistic mix, right, of religious belief that was in the Roman Empire in the 1st century. And in that environment, there were no Christians. I mean, when this thing started, you'd have to admit that they were not in a Christian-dominated culture. They were in either Jewish-dominated culture, depending where they were in the empire, right, in that area around Jerusalem, or they were in a pagan-dominated culture of the Roman Empire. In fact, early Christians, they were facing incredible hardship, right, incredible persecution. And I think historically, especially where Christianity is growing, I think it is safe to say that most Christians became believers despite the fact they were in Christians that were not, in cultures rather, that were non-Christian. I mean, think about this in places like China or in other environments where we're now seeing the growth of Christianity in an explosive way. Do you realize how many Christians are coming to faith? How many Muslims are converting, for example? I mean, you cannot argue that that's only happening. They're in an environment that's clearly not Christian. How do you explain the explosive growth of Christianity in such an environment? I think what we're doing here is helping them to see that I think it's, you can say that in our local context, right? If you're talking to somebody in America, they would say, well, no, most Christians become Christians because they're raised in a Christian country. I'm not even sure you can say that about the country, to be honest, but okay, fine. But you cannot look at that historically, because most Christians historically, especially where it arises out of cultures that are... Christianity has changed nations, has changed empires historically. And that means it had to take the majority group and convert them. I don't think you can argue historically that most Christians were just Christians because they were raised in a Christian nation. Certainly you can't use that as an explanation in the first 3 to 5 centuries, right? And you regionally now can't use this when you see it exploding and growing in places like Africa. So I think we have to be fair about this, that you might be able to point to America and make such a claim, but you cannot make that claim historically. That's how I would want to start to answer this objection. But I think there are 2 other ways you can answer the objection as well, and we'll start to look at those right after the break.
Jim, I've heard you say, I'm not a Christian because it works for me. I'm a Christian because it's true. How important is this evidence in truth when we're sharing our faith in a hostile culture like we live in America today?
If I wanted to look for an example of how Christians proclaimed the truth about Jesus in a culture that was growingly, or really even began to be very, very hostile toward Christianity, I think we do have an example of that in Scripture. I think that's what's happening in the book of Acts. You're in a cultural environment that rejects this claim, that for the most part is aligned against it. It's far worse than the culture we're in today. So if you're looking for an example of this, it's not as though there weren't great philosophers and thinkers in the Roman culture that the first disciples were working in. There were. They were some really fine thinkers, poets, authors. But the apostles had a very distinct form of evangelism. And here's what it was. It wasn't, do you ever lie? Well, then you're a liar. Do you ever steal? Well, then you're a thief. It was not that kind of an approach. It wasn't kind of 4 steps to, it was always the same approach over and over and over again. The approach was, hey, the Old Testament prophesied about this resurrection, and we saw it with our own eyes. So every effort to communicate the gospel begins and ends in the book of Acts with, we were eyewitnesses of the resurrection. Look through all those examples. You're going to see that's it from Pentecost and Peter all the way through. It's over and over again. We saw the risen Christ. As a matter of fact, if you want to be part of the 12, in Acts 1, when they're up in the upper room trying to select a replacement for Judas, you had to be the guy, somebody who had seen Jesus from the baptism to the resurrection. So what they're looking for are eyewitnesses. Isn't that interesting? So it's a very evidential approach, using direct evidence, eyewitness testimony, as the foundation for sharing the gospel. So that's what's really interesting to me. I think what we have to be able to argue for our culture is, do we believe the resurrection occurred? And do we have good reason to believe? Now, they would have said, yeah, we have good reason to believe because we saw it. But we can say we have good reason to believe this because I'll walk through it for you and I'll show you that. But the problem, of course, is if you ask most people in our church culture, hey, can you give me some reasons why the resurrection is a reliable, why should I even believe in such a thing? We find ourselves not really with robust answers. So I think we really have to start having better answers to why we believe the resurrection is true. Okay, we've kind of teased out this idea that there's a rich history globally in which Christianity has not been the dominant view of a culture, of a nation, and yet the entire nation was transformed by the claims of Christianity. Look, the reason why this claim against Christianity, that you're only a Christian because you were born in a Christian nation, it has power. The reason why it's even being offered is because there's a claim against the truth value of it. In other words, it's not true, it just is convenient. It's not true, it's just available to you in this culture. It's not true, that's not why you're a Christian. Now, here's the problem with that. You know and I know that there are a lot of people who are Christians not because it's true, because it was convenient for them. They don't even know. They have what I would call an untested blind faith. In some ways, they're almost accidental Christians in the sense that they're in a true worldview, yet they don't even know the evidence that supports it. They don't even know why it's true. You can be in the truth by accident. You haven't examined it, and you happen to believe it's true, but you don't know why it's true. I'm fine with that you're in the right place, but you're there accidentally, let's be honest, and you might just be there because you were born into this system or raised in this system. You've never examined it for yourself, and it might even be that your parents were in the system for the same reason. So we have to at least admit that that's a possibility for a lot of people, and we see that all the time, right? But I think it's going to be important for you and I to be able to demonstrate why it is true. Because in the end, if we're not in the system, because it's, if it's not your experience that you're a Christian because you were raised that way, then why'd you become a Christian? This opens up the opportunity for us to discuss the evidence. This is why I wrote a book like Cold Case Christianity, right? I wrote that book because I wanted to be able to argue, to show why I am a Christian today. I often say that I'm not a Christian because it works for me, and I'm not a Christian because I was raised that way. It's whether or not it's true that mattered to me. We'll talk more about that in the next segment, but let's just go on now and give you a second way that you might be able to respond to this claim that, hey, Christians are only Christians because they were raised in Christian cultures. Let's be specific now, related to the nation we kind of teased out in the last response. Here it is on your screen. Did you know that China specifically has a history of religious suppression related to Christianity? You probably do, right? Because it's in the news a lot. We see it in the news. The native culture of China is not Christian. It's historically embraced some form of Shintoism or Taoism. Christian missionaries, for example, historically have labored in China for centuries, up and down, some success, some failures, been driven out of the country. There's a kind of an ebb and flow of Christian missionary work in China, but their efforts were often, suppressed by the regimes that govern China, like the Communist Party of China. And even today that is happening, where there is suppression of the growth of Christianity, especially churches, are under attack in China because they do not want to see Christianity become a mainstream religion in China. But despite all that, despite the suppression, all the cultural inclination toward Shintoism and Taoism, Christianity, guess what? It's continuing to grow, regardless of that. It's an underground movement. And some now report that there are as many as 130 million Christians living in China. Can you believe that? Well, let me ask you. If people are only Christians because they're raised in Christian cultures, how do you explain the existence of all these new Christians, perhaps as many as 130 million, given the hostility of the Chinese culture? I think that's a fair question. Because if we're going to suggest, by the way, this isn't the only place that we can talk about the growth of Christianity, either historically or even as a contemporary growth currently in the world. We can point to other examples in which Christianity is growing, even though the culture is hostile to Christianity. What do you say about those folks? Even if I was somebody, and I'm not, who became a Christian because my parents said it was true, or my neighborhood said it was true, or my city, my state, my country said it was true. How do you explain those situations? See, this is the problem, right? We want to be able to argue that let's just take this out as a potential explanation. The problem is, as we said before, that for a lot of people, this is their explanation. As a matter of fact, when I wrote a book called Forensic Faith, I talked about this. I talked about why, I go around the country and I ask that question, why are you a Christian? And I discovered too, just anecdotally, that the vast majority of people I talk to and ask that question, why are you a Christian? They'll say to me they're a Christian because their parents raised them that way. As a matter of fact, the way your parents raised you is more likely to be a determiner of whether you think something is true than any other single determiner. Yes, we have rebellious periods as teenagers, we all do that, but it turns out if your parents hold a worldview, be it political, be it whatever, you are more likely than not to hold the same worldview your parents held. This is why we see religions like Islam growing internationally. It's not on the basis of proselytization. It's not that people are sharing the good news of Islam with people and they're converting. Instead, it's because Muslim countries, those couples who are Muslim, have large families. And so the groups are growing biologically. And because most of us end up adopting the views of our parents, having been raised a certain way, this is why they're far more likely to adopt that as adults. And so the movement grows on the basis of biology. Now, interestingly, as Christians, the post-Christian continent called Europe, they don't have kids. And the more we become secularized, the fewer kids we have. Which means that if you're a Christian and you've adopted a secular view of what kids do to your marriage, what kids do to your enjoyment of life, you stop seeing kids as a blessing from God, and you just have one or two. Well, you have to maintain a birth rate of about 2.3 just to maintain the status. If you're only willing to have 2 kids or 1 kid as a Christian, and other competing religious worldviews are willing to have 4 or 5 kids in their worldview, then guess what? You will be outnumbered at some point. So that's why we see this happening. So we want to be able to talk about at least that yes, for a lot of people, they simply adopt the view of their parents. But that isn't always the case. And we have seen historically that that hasn't been the case when entire nations, even like China, have been infiltrated by this disturbing truth claim called Christianity. We'll take a break, come back, and give you one final way that you can respond to this claim that Christians are only Christians because they were raised in a Christian environment.
Connect with Cold Case Christianity on social media. Visit the Cold Case Christianity homepage and click the social media icons on the top right toolbar. Jim is active on Facebook and Twitter, posting the best apologetics articles from over 250 Christian blogs around the country. You'll also find links to Jim's Instagram, Pinterest, and Google Plus accounts, along with a link to the Cold Case Christianity YouTube page. Stay connected with Cold Case Christianity and become a better Christian case maker. Be sure to visit the Cold Case Christianity website daily to read Jim's blog, watch the weekly video, or listen to the Cold Case Christianity podcast. You'll also find great free resources, including the free downloadable monthly Bible insert. While you're there, be sure to sign up for Jim's daily Case Notes email. Cold Case Christianity is designed to help you become a better Christian casemaker.
Okay, we're going to finish now with a very brief response that for me is specific to me. And it may be your story though too. And if nothing else, I think it's fair for us to point to other people who may have a story like mine. You probably know people like me who weren't Christians growing up. And the story of people who aren't Christian, I think, is helpful. This is why, we sometimes default to testimony and stories and narratives. I don't make that my major emphasis. My major emphasis will always be evidence outside of my own experience, but that's my own weakness, I believe, as a communicator. Here's why I say that. I was somebody who did not trust human experience only because my dad remarried, and his second wife, my stepmother, raised 6 half-brothers and sisters, LDS, Latter-day Saints, Mormons. And they are really Mormons because of experiences. They've had experiences that they interpreted to be the work of the Holy Spirit that confirmed for them that Joseph Smith's a prophet of God and the Book of Mormon is true. So before I even began studying any kind of claim about God, his existence, or his nature, I was suspicious of experience. And even now, I very seldom will offer my testimony, quote unquote, my experience, my conversion story. As a matter of fact, when people ask me for this, even on radio or on television, I usually stop them and say, you know what? I could tell you, but it doesn't matter. My testimony doesn't matter. And I often say, and neither does yours, or anyone's, because the question is simply, is it true? Not, do you think you've had an experience that can... Now, I think that your experience can be woven in, because you have to test experiences. We're told to do this in Scripture. I don't think my family has not tested their experiences. They've had experiences that they think are related to God, but they haven't tested them to know if they really are from God. And that's why it's so important for us to test experiences. Look, I will use my experience as part of a larger cumulative case. I might have 15 reasons to believe this is true that aren't about me, and I might add mine as the 16th. But I have to vet my experiences through a filter of evidence to know if I can trust my own experiences. And some people don't do that. And they end up on the basis of experience in the wrong religious worldview, in the wrong worldview, period. So I'm going to offer as a third response to this, a very personal response. And this may not be your response, but you could always point to people who you know who have had a similar response. Let's get after it. I'll put it on the screen. All right, so tell me, if you think that all Christians are simply Christians because they were raised in a Christian environment, how do you explain the existence of atheists who became Christians even though they were raised in atheist families? They might be here in America, and you might argue that somehow America at least was a shadow of a Christian nation, or maybe still holds a largely Christian worldview. But many of the families that are living within that worldview are openly hostile to Christianity. In other words, they have a familial microculture. But in spite of that microculture, they converted to Christianity. That was my story. I was not raised in a Christian environment, and I made it all the way to 35 without seeing the culture as dominantly Christian. It never dawned on me how many Christians there were in the culture, or how much of what we believe as a culture was grounded in Christianity. I largely ignored that. I believed we were in a dominantly secular culture. But here I am. And believers like me, they didn't become Christians because Christianity was the default religion of their family, or even their perception of the culture. How do you explain their conversion? How do you explain my conversion, given that truth? So what I'm trying to focus on here is this idea of, okay, yeah, maybe we are in a culture that even now, if you poll people, 68% or so will self-identify as Christian believers of one stripe or another. But even though they might identify that way, they don't necessarily live as though they're Christian believers. And if you poll them to see what they think Christianity teaches, they largely are ignorant of what Christianity teaches in a variety of categories. So you could argue that, yeah, you're in a Christian nation, America. But I'm telling you, in Southern California, for 35 years, I was able to live as though it wasn't a Christian nation. I never felt that inclination. I never felt, it was not on the basis of anyone's testimony or influence on my life, aside from Susie, my wife, wanting at some point, let's check this church out. Fine. Well, we were together for 18 years. I never felt any pressure during those first 18 years that I needed to become a Christian for her. At all. We lived secularly for that entire time. We never prayed at a dinner table. That wasn't part of our life. We were together for 18 years before either one of us became what I would say now are Christian believers. I think Susie was far more open to the existence of God than I was, for sure. But she never spoke about it in front of me. Never. Even today, I find out things about what she believed in those first 18 years that surprise me because I never saw that. So what do you do with people like me who may be in what you're identifying as a Christian culture but didn't live that way and didn't see it that way, didn't perceive it that way, and even the people I was around affirmed my secular atheist worldview? I think there's lots of examples of people like me. So in this case, I would say, even though it may be true for a lot of people, who cares? It's not true for me. How do you explain me? How do you explain people like me? I had nothing in my life that was broken that needed fixing. I didn't run to church because I was trying to solve a problem. All the church really did, all the Christian worldview did for me is create problems because I realized now there was a standard that I was ignoring for a lot of years. I knew I needed to become, I wanted to become now something that I'm not. I struggle every day to be the man I think I'm supposed to be given my Christian beliefs. Much easier for me to live before I became a Christian because I always hit the mark. As I say all the time, it's easy to throw the dart against the wall and just go draw the bullseye around wherever the dart lands. It's a lot harder to have the bullseye hanging there first. And that's what Christianity does, is it hangs a bullseye. And then when we miss it, we know it's sin. We recognize our failures. So I think in the end, we want people to see that they're going to have to find a way to explain people like me, people who are atheists and see the world around them as largely atheistic, who even at some point examine the evidence, discover it's true, and now they're a Christian not because it works for me, not because I was raised this way, but because it's true. I hope that helps you to think about how to respond to this objection. And I'll see you right here next week at Cold Case Christianity.
Thanks for joining us at the Cold Case Christianity broadcast. If you're interested in more information about this week's topic, please visit coldcasechristianity.com. For a thorough investigation of the reliability of the New Testament Gospels and the case for Christianity, be sure to purchase Cold Case Christianity, God's Crime Scene, Forensic Faith, and Alive.